This happened to me. Oh, when I was very young. I looked quite different. I have always had, as you probably guessed, an interest in the dark occult. And that led me to a grasp of language. You see, to really understand what the old masters said, you had to understand their masters and the masters of those masters. And so you slipped from Latin into ancient Greek, from ancient Greek into Arabic and Old Babylonian. At last, the Sanskrit languages. And when you master those languages, you discover very quickly that there is a certain sort of professional. Oh, I don't mean a reputable professional, but rather those who would make their living through the dark arts, who do not speak the languages of the powers they rise. And so it is, you can gain some sort of living translating. It was about my 4th commission, and it was my last, because I changed my occupation then. You might understand why before we finish. Now what was his name again? It was so long. Augustus he was. Augustus called me in. Augustus Gustavus, he called himself. I fancy his forebears had been Swedish. He lived in a great house, North London, that had been left to him by his grandfather, he said, him and his brother Julius, who had left. He showed me a picture of the pair of them, and they were identical. I asked him what the commission was, and he said, we can wait, but I will need you to translate for me ancient Arabic and then ancient Sanskrit. Can you do that? And I said, yes. Easily enough. Just give me the tomes. And he looked at me and said, not quite yet. Not quite yet. I want you to get to know me. You see, I am not I'm not just a theoretical researcher. I am a practical man. And in your translations, I am going to need you to be accurate. As accurate as my brother Julius was before he disappeared in all his translations. I need to know what he knew. And he said it with such earnestness and such dark fury. No. Such menace that I was taken aback. And I said, well, yes, okay, yes. I can give you an accurate translation with all variations. With any variations you want me to. All right. You begin in the morning, for I do not want you to translate until the morning sun illumines the library. For in its light, dark powers are held dim. And then he kept me entertained. I'm not sure entertained is the right word. He was a talkative man, with much to tell of his journeys in Egypt and along the Nile down to the mystical land of Kush and below and beyond. He had much to tell me also of his travels amongst the peoples of Siberia and their shamans, and his explorations in the ancient lands of Persia and Iraq, Sumer and Babylon. And I was interested to learn in those days. I didn't know so much. I didn't know enough to know when knowing was not good. But it was strange. As we were in the house, he seemed to be always listening. I caught him listening before I heard anything. You could hear him. He would stop in the middle of his story and put up an ear. And so I started to listen. To what? A scurrying. I thought it was just mice. And I said so. What you need is a cat. And he said, yes, a big cat. And he licked his lips. A puma might do the job. And I said, well, I suppose so, but it is overkill. And he carried on with his story. And then again he stopped. There was a thump. Now this time it was a thump. And I said, well, that must have been a rat. And he smiled and said, I'd need a tiger for that one then. But it is time for bed. And it was indeed late. And he showed me to a perfectly comfortable room. And there I lay on a feather bed, one of the most comfortable I'd ever slept in, with beautiful silken sheets. And I spent the most dreadful night I have ever spent, for there was 1,000 whispers in the room, and 1,000,000 memories. I kept on seeing again and again a flashing knife, cutting through my dreams, a falling blade, and every time I seemed to wake, there it was again. The movement, the whisper, sometimes a bang, sometimes a thud. Once I thought I caught a sight of something. It sounded like a mouse. But if it was a mouse, it had 5 legs and no head that I could see. And was a strange bluish colour. And I seemed to smell, often, some sort of old, noisome smell. A smell I remembered from the war. Rotting flesh. It was a relief when all was said and done, when I woke up and the morning light shone bright, and I was shown into the library, and there was an ancient Babylonian text. It wasn't actually written in Sanskrit, but cuneiform. I put it at about 2,500, and it was a ritual for banishing all dark spirits, whatever their provenance. A ritual the author, who claimed to be a priest of Anu, said could banish all but the mightiest gods. And when I gave Augustus the translation, he said, "Does it say anything about wizards?" And I pointed. It said, "All but the mightiest spirits will be banished, all ghosts and wraiths and revenants and spirits unrested." "It says that," said Augustus, and he smiled. And he looked at the text, but just then, from behind him, we were in his study. His study was exactly as you would expect it to be, all book-lined, but it did have candles on the bookshelves, black, and 2 skulls there as well. And to the left there was a low table with a black tablecloth, and on it what I took to be an envelope opener, a dagger. I was a bit naive. And behind it, perhaps a bayonet or sword. But there was also in the room, to the right of him, a great chest, made of oak, it seemed. And it was from that chest the bang, and something like a moan seemed to come. But the chest, it couldn't have had a person in it. And he seemed to want to ignore it and said, No, he cannot take me. You may go now. Come back in the afternoon, for I have something else for you to translate." Well, I left him in his study, and he was pulling down other works, and he'd opened the wardrobe that was behind the door as I left, and I could smell there was incense in it. Well, I went out, and I mistook the room, my room, and came to a door and tried to pull it open, but it seemed locked. But there was a commotion on the other side, so I looked through the key. Oh, and do you know, it was strange. It was the very facsimile of Augustus's room, but dark, lit only by the window light. The same kind of books, the darker candles, but there was something about the room that gave me the shivers. Young, remember, I was, and war-soiled. I shivered to see it. I dreaded what it would look like in moonlight, and there seemed to be something moving in the room, although I couldn't quite see where or what. I could more feel it than anything. Just then I heard a sound. Augustus was coming out, and he said, "What are you doing?" "That was my brother Julius's room, and I've left it as he left it." And he went to the door and drew upon it a rune I saw, and then turned to me and said, "Lunch." Well, during lunch he told me of his brother Julius, of how he had been an even greater researcher into the dark arts, and how no doubt he had gone to ancient Sumer at the last, and not come back. But all the while he told the story, it was as if to convince himself that it was true. And all the while it seemed to me the house itself was listening. Come afternoon, he gave me a text in ancient medieval Arabic, a very difficult language. This had clearly been translated, for written on the side there was annotations written in early Greek, and one or two in cuneiform. And I asked Augustus about it, and all he would say is, "That was my brother Julius." And it was a dark piece. It told how a sorcerer who had been wronged could come back from the dead, come what may. How he could break the paths of the dead through his fury. How, if he had uttered the curse that it put at the end of the document, as his dying breath, not all the powers of the gods could break the charm. For if nothing else, he would step out of the conscience of a man without guilt or conscience. I wondered what that meant. I wondered if it meant that he would become the conscience of a man without conscience. Maybe. It was difficult to translate. It was like he would step out of the void of conscience. I pointed this out to Augustus, and he looked worried, and then snorted and said, "Well, that doesn't affect me. I have nothing on my mind, nothing at all." But I saw he shook. As I read him the dread charm, he shook. And then he said, "But the other one did say that nothing could break the spell." And I said, "Yes, nothing." And he said, "That is good. I will be busy from now on. I want you to stay another night, and in the morning, come to me. I may have other work for you to do." Well, that night, it was better than the previous night. I was tired, and the whole house was filled with the smell of gum-amory. Wild incense swirling, chanting, endless chanting, in the ancient language of Sumer, rising and falling, as drums rose and fell as cymbals played, as the ancient dithyrambs rang to heaven, and the house was filled with an exorcism, whose power I have seldom heard since. And I drifted off at last to that eerie wailing sound. Waking late in the morning, I found Augustus already awake. He seemed so much happier. He gave me bits of Latin to translate and a bit more medieval Arabic. This time it was a spell for making a man fly high into the air, and he read it and said, "Now that's a charm indeed." and all the while I felt he was listening. Listening. And it was strange. The house itself seemed to be listening itself, as if it wondered. And I realised that it was still, that for the first time all the scurrying was gone. And Augustus could almost laugh. I could hear the joy in his voice. And he said, "You must have lunch with me." And he took down his finest bottle of port, he said. Well, really, it was my brother Julius. And then suddenly at that name there came a sound, as just a little sound, such that a scurrying rat might make behind the wainscot. A rat with 5 legs. And Augustus suddenly dropped the port. And he said, "He said that much, the charm was great, but his charms were greater." And he went totally death pale. And I said, "What would you have me do?" And he said, "Take me to my study." And I put him on his bed and he said, "Now stay. Go to your room, but stay. If I call you, come. On your life, come." And I went to my room. But as I went through the corridors, everything seemed to be moving. And behind Augustus, as I went out, I heard a loud banging and a high voice calling. It was Augustus's voice, but not quite, somehow deeper and with no soul in it. And all around there seemed to be forms moving, hippity-hoppeting from the dark and the shadow. But wherever I looked, I could see nothing. I came at last to my room. And as I came, something flowed out. I could never be sure what. But I shivered and locked the door. And there was a deep throbbing going through the house, as of a charm coming together, a charm as yet unheard. And all of a sudden, I heard Augustus's door splinter. And a single voice said, "Open." And my door opened. I looked outside. "Stop," said the voice, deep and resonant. And I stood stock still. In Augustus's room, a red light burned, an oil lamp, I thought. And I heard him scream, and then the sound faded on his lips. And there was a grim silence. And then there was the most horrible sound of all. A high-pitched noise, repetitive, such as a saw might make, again and again against the bone. And I listened, in dread, unable to move or to speak, until once again the hateful voice said, "Come forward." And I stood, until I was on the very threshold of Augustus's room, and the door was half hanging off before me. And I saw, against the shadows of the room, the shadows casted the oil lamp, there was a figure standing, and underneath it there was a figure that had once been a man, laid upon the table with the black cloth. And then as I watched, the form standing dissolved. I shivered. I could have screamed. I counted to 20 and slowly then looked in. There were 2 bodies now lying on the floor, identical. 2 cut-up bodies. One Augustus's, and one identical to his. But had been dead for 3 weeks or more, for the skin was already started to rot off the face. Julius's. Julius had come again. I shivered to think he shared my name. I won't bore with you how I had to tell the police, and I explained to them all I knew, and they looked at me as if I was mad. But there was no reason to suspect me, so they let me go free. I never translated again. Can you blame me?